A young boy and a young girl sit underneath a tree reading a book quietly. Suddenly, the boy stands up and closes the book with a bright smile. He declares that he's decided to become the greatest adventurer. The girl beside him suddenly grabbed onto his clothes, complaining that it wasn't fair because she wanted to be the greatest too. The boy stares at her for a moment before breaking into a grin. He tells her that he'll be the best, and the girl named Polaris would also be the best. Determinedly, he says that the two of them would be the greatest adventurers together. Polaris gapes at him for a second before breaking into a happy smile as well, agreeing with his promise. Time passes, and the young man from before Essen stares up at a screen with adventurer rankings. He grimaces as he sees that his rank is still at 96,743 bro. That's quite the ranking. He suddenly crouches down into the ground, roughly ruffling through his hair in stress. It's been 4 years and his rank has failed to move at all. Behind him, a couple of adventurers whisper and sneer at him. In not-so-quiet voices, they whisper how even rookies were beating Essen in contributions. One of them laughs and calls him Essen the eternal last place. The man adds that he should just become a farmer already. From his place crouched down on the floor, Essen blushes in embarrassment behind his hands. Adventurer Rankings was a ranking table that automatically updates at sunrise, listing adventurers' achievements and evaluations. The names of all registered and active adventurers in the guild are recorded. Filled with fiery determination, Essen forces himself to pull himself together and not to give up. He looks back at the adventurer rankings, finding the name Polaris. He smiles proudly. He clenches his fists, remembering that he had a promise to keep with her. Suddenly, he catches parts of a conversation as someone exclaims that someone had risen up to ninth place. He looks up at a pair of adventurers on the second floor, loudly talking about Ice Princess Polaris. Damn, she has a whole title to herself. One of the men is amazed, seeing as Polaris had the fastest rise in the guild. The other man boasts that he knew from the start that her aura was totally different. Unable to help himself as he listened to their conversation, Essen smiles at their words. The pair of adventurers catch sight of his smiling face, weirded out that he was apparently smirking in their direction. Okay, to be fair, that does sound weird to be doing, Essen. Suddenly, the topic of their conversation turns to him as one of the men says that he saw Essen rummaging through a restaurant's garbage, much to the other adventurer's disbelief. The adventurer comments that Essen was the complete opposite of the Ice Princess. They move to leave, but before they're completely out of sight, they make it a point to say that just looking at Essen makes them smell like garbage and they should leave because it might be contagious. Essen manages a small awkward laugh before it falls away. He suddenly slaps his cheeks to get a hold of himself, thinking that he was already used to hearing things similar to that, so there was no point in letting it bother him. He cheers himself to do his best today as well. At the borders of the city, a large barrier blocks the path. Essen holds out a hand to the barrier and it breaks open for an entrance to form. It was the F-rank dungeon White Mist Forest. As Essen walks into the forest, he catches sight of a group of rabbits. Suddenly, a wolf throws itself at the rabbits, immediately taking one of them into its mouth. More of the beasts arrive and dig into the rabbits. Essen hid behind a tree, peeking behind it to make sure that they hadn't caught sight of him. The forest wolves were still young, so they were moving in packs. However, they still took down the swift forest rabbit so easily. Long ago, there was a war between gods and demon gods. The result was a stalemate, but with their last bit of power, the demon gods cast a curse to create monsters from the earth. In response, the gods used their last power to create barriers, dungeons, to contain the monsters, and to entrust the surface world to others in place of their wounded selves. They gave people a mysterious power called gifts. Humanity created the Adventurers Guild and the ranking system. The job of adventurers is to continually challenge the monsters living in dungeons so that the ever-increasing monsters don't destroy the dungeons. However, Essen was probably the only one making a living by gathering medicinal herbs. He pulls up various plants from the ground and inspects them. Essen takes a bite of some of the plants. Essen's gift was Monster Eater. He was given that dud gift that only lets him eat anything like a monster without getting sick. He softly laughs at himself, wondering how long he was going to keep doing what he's always done. Sneaking around, running away from mere F-rank monsters, he thought it was pathetic. Looking at the questionable thing in his hand, I honestly don't know if it's one of the plants or some sort or meat. Essen complains that he had another garbage meal that day, but at least it saves his food expenses. He's snapped out of his thoughts when he hears a scream. He hides behind another tree and peeks around it as someone screams for help. A girl sobs on the ground as before her stood a ferocious forest wolf ready to attack. Essen's eyes widened at the huge size of the adult forest wolf. The wolf growls, but when the girl screams for help once more, it lunges for her. It tackles her to the ground. Essen springs up, but he stops short. He was well aware how bad the situation was. He didn't have a gift that let him fight, and there were no other adventurers around. He clenches his fists tight, hoping for someone to come. The girl lets out a soft yell for help. Suddenly, Essen throws his whole body weight into the side of the wolf, effectively moving it away from the girl. The wolf stands a few feet away, waiting for Essen's next move. Glancing at the girl, he tells her to get up and escape. However, the girl apologizes for the large slash on her, making her unable to make a break for it. Essen's face pales at the fight of her wound. The wolf lunges again, now Essen as its target. Completely caught off guard, Essen takes the hit full force. It pushes him to the ground and he's barely able to stop it from biting into him. The woman screams in fear for him. Internally, Essen wonders if it was all ending for him in that F-rank dungeon. Without fulfilling his promise and without achieving his dream, the wolf wildly tries to bite him and Essen struggles to hold it away from him. For a split second, he hears himself think of his devouring gift, angrily asking himself if he was really going to let things end just like that. The wolf gets impossibly closer. He thinks of his gift again. Finally, blood spurts from the battle as someone is bitten. The girl screams, but the wolf is caught off guard and makes a pained sound. Even the wolf is like, "What the hell?" In his bloodied mouth, Essen holds a piece of the wolf's flesh. "Bro, how tough are your teeth? You took a whole chunk from it." Suddenly, a voice rings out in his head. It tells Essen that he had acquired the forest wolf's great fang. Essen freezes. The wolf retreats from Essen and the girl, lurking around them and waiting for its next chance. As Essen wipes the blood from his mouth, his thoughts are in a rush. He had just heard a divine message, the one people had said an adventurer would hear when their gift awakens. But Essen questions why it only activated then. The girl tries to crawl up to him, asking if he was all right. Essen is surprised at her question before hesitantly reassuring her. The wounded wolf grows once more before lunging again. Essen unsheathes a small dagger. As the wolf draws closer, he takes a slash at the wolf, but a loud snap echoes as the wolf takes a bite of it and maneuvers to the side. Essen clicks his tongue as the broken blade of his dagger falls pathetically to the ground close to the wolf. It was no use. A simple dagger like that was no match for its fangs. He needed something harder than a knife. He grits his teeth. But Essen pauses for a second, suddenly remembering the divine message from earlier. He was sure it said that he acquired the forest wolf's great fang. Essen had heard the divine message the moment he bit off the wolf's tongue. OMG, I didn't know he bit off the tongue of all places. I thought he got, like, the bridge of its snout or something. That's nasty. Essen brushes the blood at the corner of his mouth, suddenly excited at the idea. Rather nervously, he figured it was still worth a shot. He orders for his gift to activate. Almost instantaneously, something like a shadowy mask forms over his chin, forming what appeared to be the lower jaw of a wolf with tall fangs. Essen faces the wolf as it lunges for him. Essen takes a large bite out of the side of its head. The wolf drops to the forest floor, blood gushing from its wound. Essen stands over the dead wolf. He looks at it in surprise, unable to quite believe that he was able to defeat it. Slowly, the jaw-like mask over his face disappears. He hears the girl exclaim in amazement and whips his head to look at her. He runs up to her, asking if she was okay, especially with the wound on her leg. The girl reassures him that she was fine. With a bright smile, she genuinely thanks him. Essen pauses before, with a bashful smile, he thinks how he was thanked as an adventurer for the first time. Okay, that's pretty sad considering he's been an adventurer for like 4 years. The girl is rather confused by his reaction. Later on, they sit on the grassy floors next to each other as the girl bandages her wound. She exclaims at how strong he was. Essen introduces himself, adding that he had the title of the Eternal Last Place. His mood suddenly worsens, realizing what he just said. The girl apologizes, admitting that she had just recently converted to being an adventurer, thus unfamiliar with his title. She introduces herself as Yua. Essen asks about her recent conversion, and Yua explains that she was actually a farmer before, but she had some business in the forest. There were several types of gods. For example, those who worship the god of travel are called adventurers, and gain gifts specialized for fighting monsters and the right to enter dungeons. Pretty cool to hear that adventurers are for the god of travel. You'd think people made for fighting in dungeons were under a warrior god or something. Merchants worshipped the god of wealth, farmers the god of agriculture, each bringing appropriate benefits. Yua says that it must be really tough being an adventurer if someone so strong like Essen was in last place. Essen laughs awkwardly. He admits that it was actually the first time he was able to use his gift. Yua exclaims in disbelief. Essen tells her that he might have misunderstood it all that time. He thought his gift, Monster Eater, just meant he could eat anything like a monster, but it looked like he actually needed to eat monsters itself. During the fight, his gift was fully activated when he ate the forest wolf's tongue. Happy he got his gift activated, but that's still disgusting. Yua stays quiet as she listens to his explanation. Yua suggests that it might be that he doesn't get the part of the monster that he ate, but rather the monster's unique ability. Imagine he just ends up with a forest wolf's tongue. Like, what does he even do with it? Essen agrees with her thoughts. However, he thinks how up until then, eating cooked monster meat never triggered a divine message. Even discarded raw meat didn't cause any changes. He supposed that he might still have to eat the meat while it was still alive. He excitedly turns to Yua, declaring that maybe with his current gift he'll finally be able to get stronger. He pauses for a second before asking about what business she had in the forest, his question surprising Yua. Essen suddenly takes back his question, saying that he might have been a little too presumptuous. Yua looks down with a worried frown, seemingly thinking hard about something. Essen gets up with a laugh, saying that someone like him who was in last place most likely wouldn't be any help anyway. Yua softly whispers to herself. Clenching her hands together, she finally makes her choice and calls out his name. She gets up to stand and says that although it may be presumptuous of her since he already helped, she still wanted to ask him a favor. She asks if he would be able to defeat a forest cat for her. I love that the monsters are just animal names with forest tacked before each name. Essen is caught off guard by her request. Yua explains that she desperately needed the mushroom that grew on the forest cat's head, but she didn't have the money to post a collection request. Since she couldn't do it with her own strength, she begs him for the only cure to her mother's infectious disease. Essen tells her to wait a minute, remembering that forest cats were the strongest monsters in that forest. A silence passes between them. Finally, Essen turns his head away and softly says that he couldn't. Yua flinches. Essen apologizes for asking about her situation. He admits that his body had moved on its own during the fight, and if he was quite honest, he simply got lucky. He apologetically says that he couldn't suddenly take on such a strong enemy. Another pause passes between them. Finally, Yua speaks first. Forcing out a smile, Yua tells him that she understood and she apologizes for asking too much. With that, she turns around and staggers deeper into the forest. Left alone, Essen looks at the sky. The blurred-out image of another girl comes to mind. She asks him if his decision was truly fine with him. Essen doesn't say anything, stuck in place. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, Yua trudges on. She holds a large stick close to her chest as a weapon. Shaking and with tears in her eyes, she thinks about her mother and how she needed to do something. Suddenly, she's startled by a loud voice calling out her name. It was Essen, breathing hard as he ran to catch up to her. Yua is surprised to see him, but as he reaches her, Essen immediately apologizes to her for being wrong. Catching his breath, he tells her that he would defeat the forest cat for her. He admits that he didn't know if he could do it, and Yua cuts him off, saying that because of her sudden and selfish request, he would be put in danger. Essen determinedly argues that back then, he'd been using his gift as an excuse to run away, but right then he wanted to stop doing that. To be fair, as far as he was aware before, his gift was to eat questionable things without getting killed. Props to him for standing on business. Clenching his fists, he says that if he doesn't, the person he admired would laugh at him. Yua stares at him, still in tears but also touched. With a grin, Essen tells her to wait in a safe place. Yua breaks into full sobbing, thanking Essen wholeheartedly. Later on, Yua is left alone, wiping away her tears. She thinks about how Essen was probably scared too, but he still accepted her selfish request. She hurriedly looked around, wondering if there was anything she could do to help. Suddenly, she spots small footprints on the forest floor. Yua springs into action, resolute that she just couldn't rely on Essen completely. Meanwhile, in a cave hidden in the forest, a creature with mushrooms growing on its head raises its head, ears twitching. The forest cat watches the entrance to the cave. Its eyes focus on the newcomer. Essen carefully makes his way into the cave. Of course, he knew where the cat's den had been since he had been coming to the F-rank dungeon for 4 years. He presses his lips together, eyes sharp in focus. Thinking how there was no way he was moving up to a higher rank without defeating the cat anyway, Essen takes on a fighting stance as he challenges the cat. Essen decides to make the first strike. He lunges for the cat with a makeshift knife. Once he's close enough, he swipes at the air with his weapon. However, his attack misses the cat, his enemy no longer where he thought it was supposed to be. He looks up in a panic to find the cat glaring at him from its place in the ceiling. With a growl, its claws start to glow. When the light disappeared, its claws had gotten longer and sharper. Essen braces himself for the attack. The cat releases itself from the ceiling and slashes at Essen, but he's able to dodge it just in time. The cat's claws destroy the ground where it hits. Essen clenches his teeth, annoyed at the forest cat's speed and strong claws. He summons his abilities from the forest wolf, and a shadow-like jaws cover half his face. He lunges at the cat again, trying to bite at it, but the cat runs away just in time once more. The cat leaps onto a cliff, meowing at Essen. He grunts. Even with his fangs, he couldn't keep up with the forest cat's speed. Before he knew it, the cat was covered by a brilliant light as it ran towards him. It deals multiple blows to Essen, who barely manages to hold off from falling over but still earns multiple wounds. The cat had gotten even faster. He skids back with each hit. Essen curses as he's being toyed with. He makes an attempt to slash at the cat, but his attack backfires when the cat deals him a blow to the back. He looks around in a rush. Essen couldn't believe that the forest cat was only an F-rank monster. The forest cat swings its claws, slashes of air heading to Essen. He barely dodges the attack, but it breaks the ground all around him into rubble. He wonders if he had prepared better, if he could have fought more properly. He dodges again, his thoughts running wildly. He asks what he needed to defeat the monster. He needed to think of some way to break through and do something about the cat's speed. Suddenly, a figure breathing heavily arrives through the forest entrance. The person calls out to him. He turns to find Yua asking in a frenzy what she was doing there. The sudden arrival catches the attention of the forest cat. Yua answers in a rush that she thought she might be able to help Essen, and so she caught a forest rabbit for him. She throws the unconscious animal his way. Essen successfully catches it. Seeing that it was still alive, he remembers that a forest rabbit was known for its leg strength. Hoping that it doesn't just give him big ears or something similar, that would be fun to witness, not gonna lie, Essen immediately takes a bite out of it. The forest cat rushes for him once more, claws outstretched. Suddenly, a shadow-like smoke swallows Essen whole. The forest cat reaches him and swings, but Essen disappears. A familiar voice in his head tells him that he acquired the forest rabbit's swift legs. Both the forest cat and Yua look up to see Essen hanging from the ceiling of the cave. I'm pretty sure that his head crashed right into the ceiling, actually. Essen switches positions, looking up at the forest cat that remained on the ground. He thanks Yua before diving back down. Essen summons the wolf's great fangs again. Just as the forest cat had done to him earlier, he quickly bounces around it, trapping the terrified monster in place. Oh, now I feel bad. Look how scared it looks, Lamau. Finally, with one last lunge, Essen takes a bit off of its neck. Yua gapes in amazement. Essen slows to a stop as the dead forest cat falls to the floor. His abilities gradually fade. With a smile, he thanked Yua for the meal. That's a nasty way to put it, bro. Suddenly, Yua tackles Essen from behind. She exclaims that he was amazing for really defeating the forest cat. Essen gasps in shock at the sudden attack. Their eyes meet, Essen's face going completely red. Realizing what she just did, Yua immediately lets go, apologizing and reasoning that she just got too happy. Essen's heart is going a mile a minute. Poor guy is gonna die from a heart attack at this point. Changing the subject and ignoring her own embarrassment, Yua asks what gift he got from the cat. Essen realizes that she was right. He tells her that he thinks he heard the voice say something about sharp claws. Just as he raises his hands, his nails get longer just like the forest cat's. What they didn't expect, however, was that the length of his nails would stretch to the very ceiling. Both he and Yua stare up with gaping mouths. Yua laughs, teasing Essen that Monster Eater was difficult to control. Essen turns away, blushing, arguing back that since it was all still new to him, he should be cut some slack. He retracts his nails from the ceiling. After that, they cut the large mushroom from the forest cat's head. He hands the mushroom to Yua, as promised. Yua bows to him, saying that she would surely repay him for the favor someday. Essen reassures her that there was no need for thanks in the first place, because he wouldn't have even won without her. Yua grins at him. As they head out of the cave, Essen asks Yua not to tell anyone about his gift. Seeing as how people only thought of monsters as enemies of the people, if his ability gets out, he might get bullied. I think they might actually burn you at a stake, bro. Yua laughs, thinking that it really would have been troublesome. She smiles and says that she understands, but she would never forget her debt. Essen tells her to hurry back to her mother, waving goodbye. Yua thanks him one last time before bidding him farewell. Essen was still the eternal last place, but he felt like he's finally reached the starting line as an adventurer. In his head, he challenges Polaris and even adventurers he hasn't met yet. Looking determined up at the sky, Essen declares that he was definitely going to become #1 in the rankings. Meanwhile, in the Adventurer Rankings board, Essen's rank, which has been 96,743 for the past 4 years, finally moves up to 90,000. A person steps into the guild hall, their presence making people turn heads. Adventurers move away as a girl passes by without turning to any of them, despite the others recognizing her. The adventurers stare in shock and awe at Ice Princess Polaris. They burst into excited whispers as they watch her retreating back, unable to believe that she was back already. Her last dungeon, the Volcano of Destruction, was supposedly a high difficulty dungeon even for those with an A rank. Polaris stops in front of the Adventurer Rankings board, eyes scanning the numbers. She finds her name, still in 9th place. She thinks to herself that things really were just as she expected. She didn't think it would be easy to rise in her current rank bracket. Her thoughts are halted when a female adventurer beside her falls to the ground wailing. Other adventurers rush to try and help her up, unsure what was going on. The girl screams as she scans the Adventurer Rankings. She's unable to find a man's name on the board, which was there until the other day. She hysterically asks anyone if they know who she was talking about. However, they all turn to a newcomer. The newcomer says that it was most likely some sort of weak adventurer ranked lower than the 1000 bracket and that it happened all the time. The newcomer, a rather extravagant-looking man, smirks and laughs mockingly as he says that there were only 2 ways to remove a name from the rankings. Either quitting being an adventurer or dying, well, that sounds fun. Polaris recognizes the man, calling him Wellness. That's quite the choice for an adventurer name. Wellness then casually brushes off the conversation, telling Polaris that it wasn't something they needed to worry about. Changing the subject, Wellness compliments Polaris on her beauty before arrogantly advising her that they ignore the low rankers and inviting her for tea. Bro sounds like he doesn't have a lot of friends if that's how he talks to people. Polaris turns away, plainly telling him that she didn't need something like that. Wellness keeps going even as Polaris moves to leave. He suggests that since he was rank 73, it would be beneficial for them to form a party. He comments that he found her quite reserved. Polaris turns back to him and coldly says that it was because Wellness was weaker than her. Oh, damn, she ain't messing around. Offended, Wellness looks away first, angrily calling her a battle maniac who relies only on her gift. What else is she supposed to rely on? It's been working out for her for this long anyway. Polaris exhales softly before turning back around. Her eyes find their way back to the adventurer rankings. They scan down to the very bottom and Polaris freezes. Essen's name was gone from its place at the very bottom. Polaris's face morphs into panic as she looks over the names over and over. She's in complete disbelief. She knew the Essen that had used to protect her when they were children, and she knew that he wasn't one to give up easily. Her thoughts continue to spiral to the worst-case scenario, but then she stops. There in the 90,000th rank was Essen's name. A sense of clarity comes over Polaris at the sight. Without saying anything else, she turns away from the adventurer ranking board and leaves. Pretty sure she just went through the first 4 stages of the 5 stages of grief before she saw his name. Unknown to her, Wellness had been watching her. Later on, Essen makes his way to the adventurer ranking board and exclaims in delight. Other adventurers turn their heads towards him, confused at his sudden outburst. A passing female adventurer warns eternal last place Essen to not suddenly shout because he was bothering everyone. But Essen excitedly announced that his ranking had just gone up. Essen smiles smugly in the background as the adventurers close by point at disbelief at the adventurer ranking board. The adventurers around him start to burst into conversation, but not for what he thought. They ask him what kind of underhanded methods he used. One of them says that he was still at the 90,000th place. Another says it was actually easy to rise since all it took was to defeat a few monsters. Essen's proud smile slowly starts to slip off until finally someone says that there was no need to brag about something like his small rise in rank, because he probably just overtook inactive adventurers. With that, he curls up in a corner under the stairs, completely dejected. The adventurers gathered together earlier slowly dispersed, saying that if he was going to make a fuss over something like that, then he wasn't going to make it far. A more senior adventurer tells Essen that he's been without achievements for so long so his evaluation won't change quickly. Hesitantly laughing, Essen agrees with his words. He picks himself off the ground and forces himself to be more optimistic, thanking the older adventurer for putting him down so he can work harder without getting cocky. That's definitely one way to stay humble. The adventurer smiles at his positivity with a snort. Essen starts planning what to do next as the adventurers leave him be. In Essen's case, due to the nature of his gift, he should be going to various dungeons, but he's only been to the same place so he wasn't very familiar with others. At times like that, the guild counter was the place to go. The girl at the counter greets Essen with a bright smile. She apologizes for making him wait and introduces herself as Eruru. Internally, Essen exclaims how cute Eruru was. Unlike adventurers, guild staff women were gentle and intellectual. Essen tells her that since he wanted to go to an E-rank dungeon, he was looking for some recommendations. Eruru smiles warmly and tells him to wait for a second. Essen thinks that guild staff women were kind and gentle even to bottom feeders like him. They were beautiful. But according to Essen's research, although I have no idea why you would even look into that, Eruru was especially more beautiful. As she passes, Essen inhales and enjoys how she smells nice, bro. Please don't go around sniffing people. People already look at you weird. As she looks through the guild maps, Eruru turns and asks if he was indeed Essen. He's surprised, asking her if he already introduced himself. Eruru explains that he was simply famous in the lower guild. That's definitely one way to be famous. Essen laughs awkwardly and understanding, but Eruru continues that that was the reason she was so surprised when she saw the rankings that morning. She praises him, telling him that she was glad his efforts have been paid off. Touched at the thought, Essen thinks how truly wonderful she was. He wholeheartedly thanks her, but she suddenly tells him that the time when he's about to move forward is when he's most likely to let his guard down. She makes sure to thoroughly warn him. Essen grins and gives her a thumbs up. Eruru smiles at his response before laying down multiple sheets of paper on the table as they go back to their main topic. For beginners, there was the Cemetery of Rest. Quite the funny title, considering if I hear cemetery, I'm pretty sure I would immediately think that resting is the main purpose. Calling it like that now sounds sarcastic, lol. In that dungeon, the slow-moving undead monsters there are safe to deal with. Popular places like the Yellow Earth underground passage have relics left behind, so an adventurer like Essen could get some income. The Wandering Cave has rare materials, however Iruru warns him that it might be tough to do solo. Essen looks over the files of the dungeons. He didn't feel like eating the undead, and I would sure hope so because that's disgusting. Essen also wanted to avoid more popular places or ones that couldn't be cleared. Essen asks Iruru if there was a place that wasn't too popular. Iruru thinks hard about it before shuffling through the stack of paper in her hands and handing one to Essen. Rainy wetlands. In there was less competition. The monsters are standard. And the materials found there are in short supply, so they sell for higher prices. That's pretty weird. Considering how good it sounds, it's strange that it's less popular. Essen smiles at the information and decides on going for the wetlands. Essen tells Iruru that he was glad that he came to consult with her, and she encourages him to come by any time, adding that she would even give him more materials. Waving goodbye, Essen thanks her one final time and Iruru wishes him good luck. Later on, a figure passes through the barrier at an incredible speed. Suddenly, the large and shadowy rabbit-foot slides to a stop. Essen looks around as he arrives at the E-rank dungeon, the rainy wetlands. Essen continues to walk through a rather thick fog. Unable to see the murky swamp water, he accidentally falls into the pool of dark water. He crawls out and looks at his drenched feet in disgust. He finally understood why it wasn't a popular place to visit. I forgot he loses his shoes when he activates the forest rabbit skill, so I thought the swamp water fully melted his footwear lol. Just as he stands up, Essen notices something at the edge of the water. Even though the wetlands weren't popular, Essen still found it exciting to see so many new materials for the first time. He picks and plucks odd-looking shrubs and pushes them into his new magic bag. A magic bag was a magical tool with an expanded internal space. He was able to get one in exchange for the forest cat materials. Essen was enjoying the idea of using the bag to gather more items, but suddenly something long and fast darts by him. Something thick and slimy entangles itself around his neck, trying to strangle him. Essen looks around in a panic and finds a wetland frog, its tongue pining him down. The frog had poison, however, in the rainy wetlands. It was also by far the weakest enemy. Essen summons the claws he got from the forest cat, and with a crossed slash, he cuts the frog's tongue down into multiple pieces. Seeing its tongue in parts at the ground, the wetlands frog makes a run for it. Essen tries to give chase but eventually decides against it. Picking up one of the pieces of the frog's tongue, that's disgusting. Essen focuses on his goal to expand his gift. He puts the piece of tongue up to his mouth and eats as he thinks proudly that he was doing pretty well. A voice rings out in his head that he obtained the wetland frog's whip tongue. Eventually, he finishes his meal, casually cleaning his mouth. That's unimaginably nasty. Just then, Essen's throat constricts painfully. He claws at his throat, confused and dreading what was happening to him. Before he knew it, he was foaming at the mouth. He curses over and over at the pain. He grabs at his burning throat to no avail. As he's forced to his knees, he drops the magic bag. He makes a rush to rummage through the bag in a panic as he's slowly unable to breathe. Finding what he was looking for, he takes out a large vial of potion. He downs all the contents as soon as possible, only taking a breath once he is finished. Breathing heavily, he softly reprimands himself for letting his guard down. He's thankful he prepared an antidote, seeing now that Monster Eater couldn't neutralize poison. Essen comes to the conclusion that gifts weren't omnipotent and he sighs, saying how Iruru's warning was spot on. Finding the E-rank dungeon quite a formidable challenge, Essen grins in determination. Time passes with Essen carrying on in the wetlands. As he walks, he's unaware of a certain wetland frog following him around before ducking away. Essen looks down at one of the info sheets for the rainy wetlands monsters. He wanted to get powerful abilities if possible. However, if they were too strong, he wouldn't be able to defeat them. Not only that, he was already out of antidotes, so he needed to eat meat that was safe to be consumed. Turning to his side, he suddenly crouches to the ground as he sees familiar creatures on the other side of the rock formations and murky pool of water. It was a wetland lizard. Seeing as it had no poison and it was expected for him to get some useful skills like its scales, Essen rushed in using his forest rabbit legs. He also summons his forest wolf fangs as he tries to go in for the first strike for the win. One of the wetland lizards notices him. Essen decides on using his new skill and he opens his shadowy jaws for a long tongue to come out. His wetland frog tongue stretches out and reaches for the lizard. It tangles itself around the lizard's body. Essen ends up being pulled over to the lizard. As he does so, he goes in to bite at the monster's body, but his teeth don't sink in all the way, and the lizard remains mostly unaffected by his attack. Well, this is awkward. Essen panics at the unexpected strength of its scales. Eventually, another lizard notices him. Using its tail, it slams Essen away from its companion. Essen and his frog's tongue are forced to let go and he goes flying. The lizards are angered, the one that Essen attacked even more so, as it had a noticeable wound where he bit down. Essen was able to rip out a part of its scales. He sits up, and using the forest wolf's fangs, he chomps down on the scales and swallows. A voice tells him that he was able to obtain the wetland lizard's blade tail. Essen immediately summons it out. He takes a battle stance, almost all his skills out in the open. Threatened, the lizards hiss at him. Essen, remembering that their tails sold for a high price, decided that he needed to defeat the lizards properly. The lizards rush in and Essen meets it halfway. They crash into one another. All three bounce off from the other due to the impact. Essen's eyes brighten in exhilaration, and as he has fun, he could feel himself getting stronger both in gift and physical abilities every time he ate a monster. He was able to become even stronger. He stretches out his frog's tongue. It wraps itself around the dead tree trunk behind the lizards. Essen whips around using his tongue like a rope and pulling himself closer to the lizards at an amazing speed. Before the monsters could react, Essen is pulled over and slashes down at one of the lizards using his forest cat claws. The other lizard is caught by surprise. Its panic spikes and immediately decides to run away. It turns around to make sure that Essen wasn't chasing after it. But as it faces in front, Essen is already there. A daggered tail springs out for an attack. Essen's tail cleanly goes through the lizard. With a cough of blood, the lizard goes down. Essen pumps his fist in the air at his victory as his shadowy skills slowly fade back away. Pulling his hood up, he decides with a content sigh that he was going to call it a day. Set out on a blanket, he was able to get a lot of materials too, even better than he expected. The sun had begun to set back in the city. People of all sorts walk and run down the busy streets. Essen hums happily to himself as he walks. He was able to get a lot of money from selling materials. Maybe he could even get some good meat on his way home that night. It also wouldn't be bad to buy necessary materials for the future. However, he suddenly remembers that above all, he needed a pair of pants. Unfortunately, he didn't notice during the fight, but his new tail skill had torn through his pants, making him wonder why he felt rather cold, bro. You should have known that would happen when your rabbit legs straight up destroyed your shoes the first time. Right now, here in the city as he walked the streets, he only had a dark piece of cloth tied around his waist and covering his backside. In other words, right now, he is half-ass Essen. I'm happy to know that he has the heart to make quality jokes about himself. He starts walking faster down the street, focused on getting to a clothing store as quickly as possible. It would be bad if he ran into someone he knew. You just jinxed it. Almost immediately, dust is kicked up and the air glitters as a figure appears, calling out his name. Essen completely freezes up. Pun not intended. His thoughts spiral, hoping that it wasn't the right voice, but they call for his name again. Behind a rather distressed Essen was an awkwardly standing Polaris. She meekly congratulates him. Standing properly, she tells him that she saw that his ranking had gone up. Essen starts to turn around instinctively, ready to speak to her, but he holds himself back just in time, clenching his teeth. He keeps his back turned to her as she praises him for his hard work, although she didn't know what he did. Polaris was a high-ranking adventurer, and Essen believed that there was no reason for her to come to the lower district. He grits his teeth. He had thought that she had long forgotten about him, but now he wonders if she still thought about him. He raises his head, trying to keep his tears in check as he calls himself pathetic. He roughly brushes at his eyes. Polaris carries on, hopefully suggesting that since he was able to fight now then they should form a party together. But almost immediately she's cut off as Essen turns her down, brother. That's way too harsh. Repeating himself, Essen tells Polaris that he couldn't do that, much to her shock. With clenched fists, he explains that he knew that his ranking would easily go up if he formed a party with her. Polaris stays quiet as she listens. Essen continues that that wasn't the kind of adventurer he wanted to be. It was selfish and petty pride, but Essen determinedly tells her that he would definitely climb up the rankings on his own. Polaris ends up smiling fondly regardless, calling him selfish and how he hasn't changed at all. Essen has the same fond smile. Breathing deeply, there's a pause before Polaris says that she understood and she would wait. With a bright smile, she says that she would wait for Essen. Essen holds a thumbs up in the air for her, and Polaris smiles once more as she turns around. The air sparkles once more as she teleports away. Finally, Essen turns around to see the last of her magic. Essen clenches his fists again as he's feeling even more motivated, determined to prepare for the next day. Just as he turns back around to leave, he bumps onto someone's shoulder. He rushes to apologize, but the other person doesn't say anything. As Essen leaves in a hurry, the man he ran into carries a smug smirk. Casually brushing his shoulder free of invisible dust, Wellness scoffs in understanding as he looks at where Essen had just ran off to. Meanwhile, Essen finally finds a clothing store to buy pants from. Words cannot describe how glad I am that he kept those on the whole conversation with Polaris. Meanwhile, in the A-rank dungeon Thunder Peak, Polaris rushes at a demon-like monster with a rapier. Casting her skill Iceburn, a powerful wave of snow passes through, freezing everything on sight. The demon monster roars in anger, getting caught in the snow and rendering it frozen. With a jab of her rapier, Polaris casts Icicle Lance. The attack impales the monster, its frozen body cracking into pieces. Polaris waits for a second before smiling in victory. Her victory is cut short when lightning suddenly strikes. She jumps away just as the strike hits the spot where she stood. Polaris's eyes widen at the sight of a flying and glowing creature called a lightning worm. It looks more like a Chinese dragon in my opinion, or maybe a catfish. The monster leers down at her as Polaris successfully lands on solid ground. She runs as more strikes of lightning rain down on her. As she dodges, Polaris thinks about how she had already encountered more than 20 monsters. As expected from a dungeon in its flood season, her enemies just kept on coming. However, when she gains enough distance, she turns around to face the monster with her weapon pointed at it with both hands on the hilt. Her eyes are closed as the lightning worm nears. When she senses its presence is close enough, she casts her ultimate skill, Permafrost. Later on, Polaris walks beside a woman in a small village in the mountain regions. The woman thanks her for calming the monster's rage every year. She hopes that it stays peaceful for a while. Polaris smiles softly and replies that she wasn't exactly interested in monster ecology. As she turns away with a wave of goodbye, she tells the woman that all she did was keep defeating monsters. She leaves the mountain region. Although Polaris had said she would wait for Essen, she had no plans on staying still. Meanwhile, in a way station, Essen makes his way over to one of the traveling porters and asks to take a carriage to the port town of Leubel. The porter, seeing that he was an adventurer, tells him that they were leaving soon so he could hop onto the carriage right there and wait. Essen thanks the man. It had been a week since his reunion with Polaris. He's been frequenting the rainy wetlands and gained lots of skills. However, he thought it was about time to start venturing even further. Essen makes his way over to the carriage, pushing back the curtain to get inside, and finds another passenger sitting at the very back. The other passenger stares at him with sharp eyes. As Essen takes a seat in the carriage, the man smirks as he calls Essen by his eternal last place title. At this point, we just know that if someone calls him that, things are not going to go well. The carriage leaves the way station and journeys forward. Essen frowns as he stares the man down. Internally, he thinks how rude the man was for a first meeting. Catching his stare, the man proudly introduces himself as Keith, before Essen interjects that he didn't ask. Essen makes it a point to tell Keith that he wasn't in last place anymore. However, Keith just scoffs and shrugs him off, saying that it made no difference from his perspective. Essen's frown deepens as he wonders if Keith's rank was really just that high. Essen gives Keith a once-over, taking note of his well-worn equipment and the aura he seems to give off. Seeing the way he was looking at him, Keith defensively says that being an E rank was tough. Essen awkwardly asks if they were on the same level. Keith scoffs and tells Essen not to lump him in the same place as the eternal last place. He haughtily adds that it was merely advice for weaklings to come home. Finally, Essen has had enough. Yeah bro, go fight for yourself. Keith is surprised when Essen suddenly says to stop with his eternal last place nonsense already. We can play a drinking game with the amount of times Keith calls Essen that way. Essen tells him that his title wasn't his name. Keith basically shrugs off his words, pompously saying that Essen was quite ungrateful for someone's kindness. Calling him Pessin instead, Keith challenges him to show that he was worthy of rising above. Essen takes on his challenge, although he really didn't have a reason to prove anything to Keith. Keith smirks at him. The carriage stops, and the porter from before lifts the curtain of the carriage to let them know that they had arrived. Essen stands up excitedly. He jumps off the carriage with a yell, exclaiming that it had been a while since he traveled that far. Keith exits right behind him, commenting that he was acting like such a kid. Essen replies that he just couldn't help it since he didn't travel much before. Essen turns to the side and exclaims at the sight of the wide sea. Essen's smile is wiped off his face when Keith calls him Pessin again. Essen corrects him, but he asks what Keith wanted nonetheless. Keith haughtily tells him not to say his name so casually before asking Essen if he planned on heading to the dungeon immediately. Essen threatens to beat him up, but he tells Keith that he was going to at least check it out. Asking what Keith's plans were, the sharp-eyed man laughs mockingly that, unlike Essen, he had the luxury of starting his conquest the next day. Essen rolls his eyes and blocks out the rest of what he was going to say. Essen really did meet quite a strange guy. Time passes and waves crash into the side of rocks at the seabed as Essen arrives at the E-rank dungeon, Roaring Reef. Eruru had told him about a not-so-popular dungeon spot once more. Punching his fist into his palm, Essen smiles at the idea that he would be able to acquire new skills to his heart's content and earn some pocket money from subjugation requests. He starts to stretch his muscles. Unpopular dungeons regularly received subjugation requests. If the endlessly spawning monsters exceed the acceptable limit, the barrier could break, causing a disaster called overflow that attacks people. Essen leaps up the rocks and lands on a cliffside. The rewards are generous to make up for the lack of popularity. This time it was the subjugation of 3 leaf crabs. Looking down at a group of leaf crabs swimming about in shallow water, Essen remembers hearing about how monsters nearly destroyed the neighboring village when he was a kid. Beyond rankings and rewards to prevent such things from happening, Essen decides on taking subjugation jobs like that occasionally. Essen summons out his tail he received from the wetland lizards. One of the leaf crabs looks up in alarm as something closes distance. With a resounding snap, Essen throws the full force of his tail on the crab, but his tail bounces back. He exclaims at the hardness of its shell. The crab's eyes follow him past its cracked shell. Just as Essen lands on his feet, the crab prepares to attack. With a swift slash of its pincers, it swipes at Essen, but Essen dodges in time, throwing himself into the air, and the crab's pincers cut the large rock behind him into two. Essen's face goes pale seeing what happened to the rocks. He lands back on his feet some distance away. Essen is horrified, unable to believe that the leaf crab only had the attack power of an E rank. The crab seems to mock him, motioning its claw towards him. Essen grins at the challenge. He wonders if maybe he had gotten used to being underestimated, but he was already used to that kind of thing. Going back to the fight, he lunges for the crab. The weakness of a crustacean monster was their belly and their relatively slow forward and backward movement. Essen clenches his fist, his daggered tail following close behind. Hitting it from underneath, he deals an uppercut that topples the crab onto its back. Essen smiles. After all, once they were flipped over, they wouldn't be able to do anything. The crab's legs frantically scuttle in the air, but that was it. He grabs onto one of the crab's legs before summoning out one of the forest cat's claws to cut the leg off. He exerts some effort in doing so since even the base was hard. He eventually cuts it off. The insides were full of pure white crab meat. He takes a bite. Immediately he exclaims at how delicious it was. Firm, elastic meat texture, rich broth aroma, and the natural sweetness perfectly matches the sea-derived saltiness. Essen suddenly stops short, thinking that if he started his own seafood restaurant specializing in crab dishes, he might possibly dominate in the field. His thoughts are suddenly consumed with the image of Polaris and how they could possibly run the place together. That's quite the imagination, bro. Try inviting rank 9 to retire and start a seafood resto LOL. He suddenly slaps his hands over his head and calls himself an idiot. Filled with determination once more, he reminds himself that his dream wasn't to be number 1 in the restaurant rankings. Picking up the leaf crab parts over his shoulder, he reprimands himself and says that with such wavering resolve, he would never be able to catch up with Polaris time passes. Essen ends up in the seaside town and decides on looking for a decently cheap inn. He's stopped in his tracks at the smell of delicious soup. The scent makes him turn to a building called Coral Inn. He opens the door and the man at the front counter asks him if he was an adventurer staying over for the night. Essen says yes and that he would like to stay for about 5 days. The man offers to let him stay for as long as he likes and Essen thanks him. Suddenly, he hears the loud voice of a child exclaiming at their older brother. A man in the building boasts that he was the strongest adventurer, and he came to the region's dungeon for reasons, but mostly it was merely a detour. This can't be good. The man turned out to be Keith, boasting to a young boy, showing off his bandaged arm. Keith tells the boy that it was the scars befitting a strong warrior known as Keith of the Scorching Sun. The boy exclaims at the coolness of Keith having his own title. Watching this all happen in front of him, Essen wears a complicated expression like a mix of cringe and disbelief. Just as Keith raises his spoon to take a sip of his soup, he notices Essen's presence. Pointing to Essen using his spoon, he tells the child to look at his underling who just arrived late. Essen glares at his words. The boy's eyes sparkle at the idea of Keith having an underling, kid. You shouldn't believe everything some stranger tells you. Walking closer to their table, Essen asks Keith what he was doing, to which the dark-haired adventurer sarcastically replies saying he was having dinner. Barely hiding his anger, Essen says that wasn't what he meant and he was referring to Keith feeding children lies. Leaning back on his seat with a smirk, Keith says that if Essen's ranking was still lower than his at 70,000th, then it was all the same to him. Calling him underling big bro? Oh, that's about to do numbers on a man's ego. Almost worse than the eternal last place, the boy asks Essen what his ranking was and if he had a title. Essen hesitantly answers that he was around 76,000 and slowly lies that he had no title. Keith doesn't let him escape, however, and asks if Essen had already abandoned his title as the eternal last place. Take a shot. Essen asks if he was allowed to cry now. Keith grins mockingly, saying that if Essen wanted to lecture him, he should first surpass him. Essen has no reply to his goading, just quietly crying at the harsh reality. Softly cursing, he mutters how he was already working hard to get stronger as of late. Keith doesn't take too kindly to his words, scoffing and saying that his efforts were nothing. With a harsh glare, he says Essen might be getting cocky because he had luckily began rising in rank. But for Keith, he still knew him as the one who used to laugh off insults with a grin. Standing up, he admits that he despised Essen's true nature. Essen clenches his teeth in anger. When Keith passes by him, he places a hand on Essen's shoulder and tells him that for someone without achievements, he only told him a fair assessment. Keith shrugs on his worn-down cloak and leaves the building. Essen watches him go, still rather angry, while the boy at the table is in awe. Later that night, as Essen lies down in bed, he frowns and curses at himself for being unable to retort to whatever Keith said about him. Bro, I don't think you could have said anything that would have gotten through that thick skull of his. Suddenly, there's a knock at his door and Essen gets up to let the person in. Opening the door, the boy from before greets him with a wide grin. The boy introduces himself as Nick, son of the owner of the inn. He asks for Essen's name and Essen introduces himself. Nick asks if he wanted breakfast prepared since his dad was asking. Essen agrees before commending Nick for helping around the inn. Showing the mop in his hands, Nick proudly tells Essen that he was saving up his allowance to buy a sword, and after that he would be able to conquer dungeons. Essen smiles and praises him for his dream. Essen fondly thinks how he was once like that as well. Using the mop to slash at the air, Nick announces that he would quickly surpass underling Big Bro, which was Essen and other adventurers. With a laugh, Essen says that he can't fall behind either. Suddenly, Nick says that he wouldn't lose either, especially not to a low-ranking big brother without a title like Essen. Essen clicks his tongue, taking mental damage at the boy's words. Clenching his fists, Essen thinks of how in his world, ranking truly was everything. Numbers were the sole indicator and strength determines one's worth. That was why adventurers aimed for the top. Essen reminds himself that someday he would surpass Keith and eventually Polaris. The night passes and it's another day at Leubel. As Essen eats, he catches sight of a man ready to leave the establishment, thanking the owner for the meal. Quickly downing his meal, Essen goes to leave as well, thanking the owner for his breakfast as he exits. As Keith walks, he hears someone call out his name. He stops and turns. He sees Pessin calling for him and continues walking. Essen catches up to him and starts to correct him about his name before deciding against it and says that since Keith was heading over to the dungeon, he asks if he's allowed to join him on the journey. Keith grunts, but he lets Essen follow him anyway. As they walk side by side, Essen smiles at him and thanks him for the other day. He tells Keith that even if he was in good form, he still had a long way to go, and so he preferred that kind of treatment to being fawned over. Bro is a better person than I because that patience level is truly something. Keith smiles, happy at the sudden praise, and says it was only natural for the strong to advise the weak. Essen laughs that it wasn't exactly advice. As they walk, adventurers pulling a large cart behind them pass by. Inside the cart were multiple leaf crabs tied up. Keith and Essen watch the cart pass by. Keith comments that he's never heard of anyone taking the crabs in alive, and Essen comments that maybe there was someone with a hypnosis gift in the group of adventurers. Since some of them were used as ingredients, Essen suggests that maybe fresher ones fetched a higher price. Keith agrees, but his voice slowly dies off as his sharp eyes linger on the cart. Eventually, Essen and Keith arrive at the dungeon. Essen points to one side of the dungeon, letting Keith know that he was heading over there since they both went solo. Keith is confused at his words, thinking that the idea was understood since there was no benefit for him to team up with Essen. Essen frowns at him, reprimanding him that he didn't have to say it in the way he did. But before Keith leaves, he tells him to call out if something happened to him. Essen lets out a half-hearted, exasperated sigh, and so he starts his dungeon diving for the day. A monstrous creature with lots of teeth shrilly screams in intimidation, but its squeals are cut short when Essen summons out a large pincer and grabs onto the monster. He screams in effort as he uses the pincer to cut the monster's thick tentacle-like body parts. Rushing in, Essen takes a bite out of the monster. The great pincer he got from the leaf crab was incredibly powerful. He leaps into the air and like a falling lance, he impales the monster. Essen stands back straight, forcing his pincers away. Essen was sure he had just battled a leaf star. He kneels down, wondering out loud to himself what kind of skill he would get from the leaf star, when someone suddenly yells in pain. Essen immediately gets up, recognizing Keith's voice. He makes a run for it to where he was supposed to be. He catches sight of Keith, curled up on the ground and surrounded by smoke. When Essen nears him, he stops short in horror as the smoke clears. Keith grits his teeth in pain. He holds onto his left arm, which was completely burnt. Essen walks closer to Keith. In a worried voice, he asks about Keith's burnt hand, wondering if he was attacked by a monster. Keith is surprised by his presence. With a smirk and a scoff, he says no. Instead, he points to a burnt monster's body behind him and tells Essen that if he was Keith's opponent, he would be the burnt body floating on the shallow water. Looking closer, it was the burnt body of a leaf crab. Essen is shocked and in awe. Internally, he thinks that even with his gift, he couldn't have broken through the leaf crab head-in, but Keith was able to burn it to a crisp. As he wonders what kind of gift Keith had, Keith pulls out a potion from his bag. He uncorks the bottle with his mouth before splashing his arm with the liquid. As Essen wordlessly watches Keith's hand heal, Keith explains that his gift was called Scorching Sun. It was a gift that allowed him to create flames. That's kinda badass, not gonna lie. Simple, but definitely effective. Heavily breathing from the pain, Keith asks if Essen was jealous, adding that it was a gift befitting of him, who was destined to be the strongest. Essen frowns and internally thinks that gifts that manipulate elements were rare and versatile, so he could see why Keith called himself the strongest. Do agree that it explains the ego. Essen turns to Keith's hand, which was slowly healing. He asks Keith if he got burnt like that every time he used his gift, but Keith shrugs his concern away, saying that it couldn't be helped. Essen argues that the cost of burn medicine must be ridiculous, adding that waiting for his body to recover each time would be inefficient. Keith argues back that it was the fate of the strong. Rather confused, Essen asks him what his reason was for being an adventurer if he had to go through all that. He thought that the drawbacks were way too big. Finally having enough of his questions, Keith repeats his answer. There's a pause between them. Keith glares at the ground and declares that he would become the strongest. An image comes to his mind of a child in the middle of the ruins of a village. Determinedly, he says again that he had to become the strongest. He walks away from Essen. As he watches Keith's retreating back, Essen thinks of Keith sacrificing his body in exchange for strength over and over again. No matter how strong he looked, Essen knew he would always reach his limit. He wonders how Keith planned on becoming the strongest if he continued to stay as is. Suddenly, a couple of men pass by in a hurry, yelling that the town was done for. As they pass by Essen, he hears them plan on hurrying up and informing the travel god church. Ethan and Keith watch as they pick up the pace and leave. Suddenly, they hear someone call for them. It was a young child's voice calling for his big brothers. Essen immediately recognizes the child as Nick. He stops running in front of them, and in a rush, Essen asks what was wrong. Breathing heavily, Nick informs them that the port market was in utter chaos because monsters were attacking. Essen and Keith are in shock. Without thinking twice, Keith breaks into a run towards the port. Essen tries to call him back. However, Nick also urges him to hurry up and come with them. As they get near to the port market, Essen stops in horror. Right in front of him, as Nick had said, the port market was a mess. Everyone was running and screaming in panic, the buildings trashed and ruined. Essen asks Nick what completely happened. Nick explains that they were auctioning off live monsters, and apparently the monsters all started rampaging. Essen suddenly remembers the cart of monsters that they passed by on their way to the dungeon. His thoughts are stopped at the sound of a large explosion in the middle of the market. Seeing that it was a large pillar of flames, Essen immediately figures out that it must have been Keith. Nick recognizes that it must be towards the port, and he urges Essen to hurry up. They make a break for it as the townspeople run away in the other direction. From what Essen had seen, there were at least 10 leaf crabs on the cart. Knowing that he would try to kill all of them, Essen begs Keith not to do anything reckless. Meanwhile, in a tornado of flame, someone makes soft gasps of pain. Multiple leaf crabs are burnt to a crisp. Keith stands in the middle of the scattered corpses, his arm outstretched and fresh from the attack. His arm is completely burned again. He flinched from the pain. Looking around him, he counted that he had killed 4 of the crabs. He grimaces in annoyance. Despite having killed so many, he had already used up all his burn medicine from earlier. He had been trying to lure as many as possible on the way to the port. However, he had to assume that there would be more monsters that escaped to other areas too. He's surrounded by more of the leaf crabs. Behind some of the crabs that were coming closer to him, he spots a small child hiding underneath the rubble. Keith knows that at the rate he was going, even his body wouldn't hold out. However, he still activates his gift. Flames encircle his arm as he readies for another attack. He throws the first punch at the closest crab. Casting Volcano Shot, his burnt hand hits the crab. Completely fried, the crab exploded into pieces. Okay, yeah, that's pretty sick. The other crabs are intimidated by his strength. The little girl screams in fear, however Keith stands in front of her. In a protective stance, he declares how strong he is to the monsters. Not sure if they'll understand that, but okay. He swears that he would not let them destroy the town Essen and Nick finally arrive, much to Keith's surprise. Essen worriedly asks about his arm. Keith brushes him off, saying that it was nothing serious and he still had his right arm. Essen asks if he had any medicine left and Keith says no. However, he says that he still had something to do. As his right arm starts to catch flames, he says that Nick went out of his way to call them. So that meant there was probably no one left in town who could fight. He couldn't take all of them out at once, but with a powerful blast of flames, he says that he would defeat every last one of them. The crabs that are not killed are pushed back by the force of the flames. Essen holds his arms up to protect himself from the blast. He immediately grabs onto Keith and tells him to stop or his body wouldn't hold out much longer. Keith angrily tells him to mind his own business. They continue to argue, Essen saying that he would help fight, and Keith could fight while controlling his flames. Keith argues back that he didn't need help from someone so weak, and he orders Essen to get out of town before he gets caught up in the fight. Essen tries to argue back again, but Keith butts Essen's head with his own, annoyed at his persistence. Essen holds onto his forehead, clicking his tongue at Keith's stubbornness. Finally, having enough, Essen summons the forest rabbit's legs skill. Essen prepares himself for the backlash as Keith, Nick, and the little girl stare at him in horror. Keith aims his arm at Essen, accusing him that because of his form, he was a monster disguised as a human. Essen immediately says no, saying that that was the reason why he didn't want to show his gift much, but he explains that it was one of his abilities. He tells Keith that using his gift, he could quickly scout the town. Essen understands that Keith wants to do it alone, but he argues back that he didn't want to abandon Keith either. Essen tells him that he would leave the main fight to Keith until he confirms the town's safety. If he couldn't handle it by then, he would lend a hand. Keith tries to argue back, but he can't say anything else. In a rush to solve their current problems, Essen turns to Nick and asks whether he could escape to where the adults were with the little girl. Nick falters for a second, but Essen reassures him that it would be okay because he was going to become an even more amazing adventurer than them. Nick swallows hard before he takes the girl's hand and makes a run for it. Essen calls out for them to be careful. Before Essen leaves, he begs Keith not to die and that he believes in him, calling him the strongest. Keith tells him to wait, but as Essen gets ready to dash away, he says that being selfish was something they were both guilty of. Before he could say anything else, Keith is surrounded by more crabs. Keith and Essen spring into action. Essen jumps over the town buildings checking for more people. In one of the town alleys, a crab scuttles quickly after a woman running. However, she ends up at a dead end. She collapses by the wall, breathing heavily. The crab behind her slams against a wall. She cries to herself, saying that she brought it upon herself. The crab gets closer and closer, but before it could attack the girl, Essen comes flying from above, slamming his tail into the crab. Essen breaks through its shell and the crab staggers back. He asks the woman if she was all right. The woman is surprised to see him, but she says yes regardless. However, she freezes at something behind him. The crab Essen attacked wasn't dead yet. It raises its pincer to attack. Essen wasn't able to defeat them all yet. The woman screams in horror as Essen is attacked, blood spurting in the middle of the battle. Deep in a forest, a girl holds out her hand to a passing forest wolf from afar. The wolf suddenly stops in its tracks. The girl and her companion move closer to the wolf. The girl looks nervous, but her companion leans closer to the wolf. Gaping in AEW. Seeing the sleeping wolf, the girl's companion comments that her gift was truly something. Her companion says that with the girl's gift, even beginners like them could safely defeat monsters. She grins, saying that it was a big help since her own gift was still weak. Time passes and the girl and her companion have changed. Her companion, now much more experienced, haughtily suggested that maybe they should disband the party. The girl is in shock, unsure what to say. Her companion continues that the girl always just puts monsters to sleep and can't really fight properly. Now that they've reached D rank, her companion says that the girl's abilities were becoming less effective. With a sneer, the companion says that it would be faster to defeat the monsters before putting them to sleep. She added that it irks her that the girl was just reaping the benefits. The girl, now alone, tries to look for new companions. Just as her old companion had said, she could only put monsters to sleep. If it works the same on higher-ranked monsters, it would have been welcomed, but she's unable to use it, and without any combat experience, she's turned away by other adventurers. She frowns as she's left alone once more. Suddenly, two men approach her. One of them says that they've heard that she had quite an interesting gift. The man grins maliciously, asking her if she wanted to team up since they had a profitable plan. Adding that it was a job that only her gift could do, the girl happily agrees. In the present, she stares in horror as blood scatters around her. A piece of cut flesh falls to the ground and she screams. Essen grunts in pain as the crab attacks him. Essen had used his daggered tail as a shield from the crab's attack. The dagger at the tip of his tail was completely severed. The girl behind him screams again, apologizing over and over. Essen breathes a sigh of relief, finding the attack way too close for comfort. The girl asks him in a panic if he was okay. Essen says that although it wasn't quite like a lizard's tail, it wasn't a serious injury, so he was fine. The girl starts to cry once more. Looking at her face properly, Essen realizes that she was one of the adventurers they passed by earlier that morning from the party that let the monsters out. The girl hides her face in shame. She apologizes again, saying that if her gift was only more powerful, then things like this wouldn't have happened. Essen finally understands that the other adventurers had used her gift to incapacitate the monsters. Suddenly, something taps on the floor. The leaf crab, still alive, stands up with its pincers ready. The girl screams again and apologizes, and Essen reprimands her for saying sorry over and over again. What a mood, though. The leaf crab stares at them angrily. Essen stands to protect the girl. He asks her if she could use her ability on the crabs again since his comrades were in danger. Ashamed, the girl admits that she couldn't. Essen is in shock. The girl explains that once they woke up, the monsters seemed to develop a resistance to her powers for a while. Essen yells in disbelief that they were still trying to sell them alive, and the girl apologizes once more. Softly, she says that she knew it was dangerous, but she was just so happy that her gift was needed again. Essen's mouth forms a thin line. He remembers that there were two other men and that they might have invited her because of her gift's effects. He brushes the thoughts away, focusing on needing to deal with his current situation first. He needed to secure their safety quickly and go back to Keith. Suddenly, cracks start to form on a nearby wall before finally exploding as something bursts through the alley. It hits the crab head-on, much to Essen and the girl's surprise. Essen looked up in shock and disbelief at the creature that had just appeared. The tall creature leers down at Essen and the girl, the crab they were once fighting now in its mouth. Biting down fully on the crab and swallowing it whole, Essen exclaims at the creature, which turned out to be a leaf serpent. The leaf serpent was the biggest eater among monsters. Essen couldn't believe that the two men from earlier even brought something like that along with them. He was wondering why he thought the town was too damaged for just a bunch of leaf crabs. The girl, still crying, admits that the two men had said it was delicious when grilled. It was big and would fetch a good price, so she thought she would try and capture it. Essen agrees in a panic that at that size, anyone could feed hundreds of people, but he asks in disbelief how they were planning to cook something that big. The girl apologizes over and over again for being a careless idiot. New game, take a shot for every apology. The conversation is cut off when the leaf serpent finally lunges for them. Essen barely has time to carry the girl, and the both of them dodges away at the last second. As the serpent crashes into the wall behind them, Essen makes a break for it with the girl in his arms. The serpent turns back around, glaring at their retreating backs. Essen curses at their bad situation. With the girl in his arms, he couldn't escape to the roof even with his rabbit's leg skills. He had no choice but to hold the serpent off there. The serpent gets ready to attack once more. Essen turns to the girl in a rush, catching her off guard. Making sure that the serpent stays a good distance from them, Essen tells the girl that he would handle the monster and she should escape in the meantime. The girl tells him that the plan wouldn't work, much to Essen's confusion. She explains that her gift was called Hypnotist. It put targeted subjects to sleep, however it had the downside of drawing the hate of the affected targets. Earlier on at the port market, the flame adventurer Keith held all of them off at once so they were able to escape, but she ended up being chased by the monsters that broke free. Now that the girl was separated from the rest of the monsters, their hatred shouldn't be on her anymore. But the leaf serpent was still affected. Essen understands that if they defeat the leaf serpent, they would only have to deal with the monsters Keith was handling. However, the enemy would prioritize targeting the girl over Essen. Forming a plan, Essen lowers the girl to the ground and tells her to keep running. Although the girl is surprised that she was suddenly let go, she does what he says. As she runs, Essen waits for the serpent up on a roof. Running and screaming, the girl begs him not to abandon her. Essen jumps from the roof, promising that he wouldn't do that. As the serpent gets closer to her, he orders her to get down and she crouches, her head in her hands. With a yell, Essen summons the forest cat's sharp claws. He strikes a singular large claw in between the girl and the serpent. The serpent gets closer and closer to the outstretched claw. At the speed it was going, it's unable to stop in time and it went right for the sharp claw in front of it, slicing it into half and barely missing the girl right in front. The serpent's sliced body falls to the ground in two pieces. The girl, covered in blood, slowly gets up in disbelief that they were saved. When she looks up, she finds Essen standing over the sharp claw. Essen breathes a sigh of relief. As he retracts his claw, he's amazed that his plan worked. However, he thinks it's a shame he couldn't get a new skill. He falls to the ground, landing on his feet. He jogs up to the girl, apologizing for using her as bait. The girl brushes his apology away. Essen tells her that he needed to move on quickly. Taking off his cloak that was wrapped around his waist, he tells her that with things getting that big, the Travel God Church would probably step in. However, if possible, he asks that she not tell anyone about his gift. He wraps the cloak over her shoulders. Jogging away, he apologizes and says that he was counting on her. Pulling the cloak closer to herself, the girl quietly watches him leave. Back in the port market, explosions boom all around. A singular leaf crab tries to run away, however Keith quickly finds it. The leaf crab was the last one of the escaped monsters. Keith's whole body was covered in flames, his face to his torso completely burnt. With the whole market roaring within flames, the crab is trapped with Keith in a circle of fire. The crab tries to attack one final time, but Keith holds out a burnt hand. With another rush of explosive flames, he burns the crab into charred pieces. Keith grits his teeth from the pain. The crab's body completely turns into ash. The flames around him slowly start to simmer down. As Essen arrives in the port market, he catches sight of Keith falling to the ground. He calls up to Keith in a panic. He's managed to defeat all the surrounding monsters, but the flames on his body haven't gone out. Essen rushes up to Keith and grabs onto him before throwing the both of them into the seawater. I can't imagine how much the salt would hurt on burns. Essen floats both of them up into the surface as the flames on Keith's body are fully put out. Essen calls out to him over and over again, trying to wake him up, saying that he had defeated all the monsters. Essen swims them back to shore. He pulls them back up and places Keith down on the docks. Breathing heavily from the effort, Essen calls out to Keith once more, but his words are cut short when he hears mumbling. In a muffled voice, Keith says that he was being noisy before ordering him not to yell. With a small smirk, a wounded Keith tells Essen that he was the strongest. Blinking down at him in shock, Essen breathes out a sigh of relief before saying that Keith truly was something. Seeing that Essen came back, Keith asks if the town was safe. Essen confirms, saying that he only got delayed dealing with the leaf crab and the leaf serpent, much to Keith's surprise. He's in disbelief that Essen had defeated such huge monsters. He noticed that Essen didn't have any external injuries. Essen repeats that he was able to, although he wishes that Keith had told him about the monsters. Essen assumes that the wall of flames Keith made wasn't enough to hold the monsters back, but he stays silent. Essen slowly gets back up from the ground, saying that just in case, he was planning to patrol that town once more. Slinging one of Keith's arms over his shoulders, Essen props up Keith's body using his, saying that he needed to take him to a clinic first. Keith and Essen start to argue. Keith tries to argue that he could walk on his own and that being supported by Essen was making his burns hurt more. But Essen argues back that he was lying, that Keith was putting all his weight on him, and if he was the strongest, then he should endure it. Time passes. After running around like that, they received a brief hearing from the guild branch. Thanks to that, Essen fell asleep as soon as he got to the inn. He's completely passed out for the rest of the night. The next morning, as Essen is on his way to the clinic, he passes by a figure that notices him. Turning to him, the person asks if he was indeed Mr. Essen. Essen's confused, but he confirms his identity. The person happily smiles that they were right and introduces themselves as Furcy. They were a priest from the Travel God Church. Asking if Essen had time, Furcy says that they had questions about the events of the other day. Essen nervously looks at Furcy. He hesitates, but he ends up saying yes. Just as he thought, the Travel God Church had really shown up. Percy claps her hands together in glee, thanking him for agreeing even though he must have been tired from the recent events. Furcy happily leads the way, but all Essen could think about was how, for him, the church was worse than any monster. The Travel God Church was an organization of people who served the Travel God. They also manage adventurers who possess gifts. Their role was divided into two main parts. First, to bestow blessings upon those who become followers. People go to the church when they turn 12 and decide to serve the Travel God, or when they convert, they receive the blessing of a gift. Second, they punished followers who violated the doctrine. While general crimes are handled by state organizations, all issues related to church doctrine fall under the jurisdiction of church priests. In other words, if adventures caused monster-related damage to a town, they would become the subject of investigation by the priests. And in this case, it was exactly that. Furcy leads Essen towards the town church. However, what truly concerned Essen was how extremely attached the church was to their doctrine. Absolutely do not tolerate monsters. Gifts existed to defeat monsters. The Travel God Church considers this their most important doctrine. Even though it was only just a part of him, the fact was that Essen could transform his body into a monster. This is pretty weird because even if he did turn into a monster, it's still considered a gift, so how are they going to disregard a god's blessing like that? If the priest were to discover it, he can't say for certain that he wouldn't be purged. Furcy leads the both of them inside. Percy tells Isn't to wait there for a moment at the communal area. Essen is confused, however, he takes a seat at the table. He starts to talk about the incident, however Furcy cuts him off, saying that she's already seen the investigation team's report. Essen turns to the side at the sound of rattling getting closer. He's surprised to see a whole feast right in front of him. Essen is in shock, unsure what to say. Calling him Essen the hero who saved the town, Furcy says that she wanted to meet him so badly that she arrived first thing in the morning that she hadn't even had breakfast yet. Essen sarcastically says that he wasn't given her any. As she takes a bite, Furcy asks if he wanted to eat anything, which Essen turns down. He's at a loss in his predicament, but then he pauses. With a huff, he tells Furcy that the hero wasn't him, but it was Keith, and that he just helped a little. Furcy says that he was just being modest, but Essen argues that it was the truth and he wanted to visit Keith after their talk. As such, he asks Furcy to keep it brief. Furcy tells him that she understood. Since it was an irregular monster subjugation, she tells him that there might have been some gaps, but she's already added quite a bonus to both of their contribution scores. Essen is ecstatic at the news, saying that it was a big help. Furcy smiles at him warmly. Getting straight to business, Furcy wonders out loud what to ask first. Essen is unnerved, saying that things were just as written in the report. Furcy agrees but says that it was important to hear it directly. Essen tries to explain that he didn't see the moment the monsters went berserk and that he just found out on his way back from the dungeon. Furcy understands that he wasn't even in town when the incident occurred, however, with sharp eyes, she says that she heard that he knew the culprit's face. Thinking about it, Essen says that he knew one of them, but he only passed them by in front of the dungeon, and that he didn't know their name or anything else. Essen tries to ask if the culprits have been found, but Furcy says that it was a secret. However, she informs him that the girl with the hypnotist gift was being held in a separate room inside the building. Essen is surprised at the information. Percy says that it was rare for someone to turn themselves in. Hesitantly, Essen asks what would happen to her. With a serious expression, Percy holds her knife up to her neck and says that it was, of course, the death penalty. Essen freezes in horror. Suddenly, the tension is gone from Percy as she says that it would only be after they took her gift away. Essen stays quiet. The terrifying thing about the church was that everything was at the discretion of the priests. If they had a reason, they could take away gifts and even easily decide on the death penalty. Percy says that they all deserve the death penalty, but the girl was the most guilty of them. Hypnotizing monsters and letting them out was bad enough, but losing control and plunging the town into chaos and danger was even worse. Essen thought that he reported it already, but he explains that due to the drawback of her gift, she attracted monsters, so she fled in the opposite direction of the evacuating townspeople. Trying to defend her, Essen says that she may have made a mistake, but it was a fact that the girl helped to minimize the damage. Percy pauses for a moment. Suddenly, her face twists up into a sneer. She asks him if Essen thought that someone's evaluation should go up if they defeated the monsters they brought themselves. Rather harsh, but she definitely has a point. Realizing what she was trying to say, Essen clenches his fist and nervously stays quiet. He grits his teeth and doesn't say anything else for the rest of Percy's meal. Finally, after time passes, Percy announces that she got the gist of it. Essen hesitantly stands up, saying that if it was helpful, then that's what matters. Percy says that it was a good thing that Essen and Keith were in the town. Bowing low to him, Percy thanks him over and over on behalf of the Travel God Church. Essen awkwardly acknowledges her gratitude before announcing that he was leaving. Suddenly, Percy raises her head and asks one more thing. Essen starts to walk away, but Percy explains that during the commotion, there were reports of people seeing a human-shaped monster or a human who looked like a monster. She asks him if he knew anything about that. Essen hesitates, gritting his teeth. When he turns back around to face Percy, he smiles and says he didn't know anything. He tries to say that since everyone was pretty confused, it wouldn't have been strange if there were some misunderstandings. Percy says that she understood that even Essen, who patrolled the town, didn't know anything. However, with a dark look in her eyes, she tells him that if there were any monsters pretending to be human, the church would have to execute them. Essen struggles to keep up his smile. Essen starts to nervously sweat, his smile becoming wobbly the longer he tries to remain composed. Clapping her hands together, Percy apologizes for keeping him. Finally, Essen leaves the church as Percy thanks him again and hopes that they could meet again somewhere. As Essen slowly walks away, his face is horrified and he's drenched in sweat. Essen roughly lets out a gasp in relief once he's far away enough. Exhausted from the stress, he thinks that he would rather not meet Percy again. He eventually gets back to town and finds the clinic. The moment he enters the clinic, Essen is greeted with the image of Keith lying in bed and completely covered in bandages, his eyes and hair the only things seen through the cloth. Beside him, Nick happily greets Essen. The little girl they saved from before was also there with Nick. Essen is glad that she was safe. He walks closer, asking them how Keith was doing. Nick explains that the doctor said his injuries have healed, however he needed to rest until the regenerating skin settles. Although not adventurers, doctors also received gifts from the healing god of compassion and life to treat people. Essen smiles, relieved to know the news. Suddenly, he hears mumbling. He turns to find Keith trying to speak through the bandages, his expression angry. Essen tells him that he couldn't understand what he was saying, although he could tell he was energetic. Pulling down the bandages over his mouth, Keith tells the kids not to look at him in such a pathetic state, or they would be traumatized. Suddenly, Nick explodes in a loud voice, telling Keith that he was still super cool, much to his surprise. Excitedly, he says that even if it was the other day or today, he still looked cool. Nick turns to the girl, asking for her thoughts, and she happily agrees. She turns to Keith and asks if she would be able to become an adventurer like him. Keith pauses for a moment before turning away with a blush, saying that they were a strange bunch. Nick and the girl smile at him one more time before they bid them farewell, since they had to help out at the shop. Essen watches them go with a smile before turning to Keith and saying that they would surely become great adventurers. Keith's confused by his words. Essen explains that since they've seen that back of his protecting them, they definitely could be great adventurers. Blushing at the praise, Keith agrees with Essen's words. Essen laughs lightly. Suddenly, Keith is quiet. He clenches his fist. He calls out to Essen, saying that he had one request. Essen happily waits for his words until he realizes that Keith had referred to him with his correct name.